Our next guest that we're going to bring on is Dr. Jason Cassibry. Jason is a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Prior to this, he worked as a research professor at UA Huntsville. His research involves the theoretical application of fluid mechanics, magnetohydrodynamics, I had to break that into 3 pieces, and thermodynamics in the study of plasmas with application to plasma acceleration, in-space propulsion, and fusion energy science. Specific research areas include smooth particle hydrodynamic modeling, magneto-inertia fusion, directly and inductively coupled pulse electromagnetic accelerators, MHD modeling, and high-temperature equations of state. We're going to talk about a lot of fun stuff tonight, so without any further delay, let's get him on the phone. Dr. Cassibry, welcome to K-Talk, the Fringe radio show on AM 630.
Thank you so much for having me on and for the introduction there. No wonder I feel so busy when you hear it read out loud. I mean, no wonder.
Well, I tell you, Jason, I had to take that word, magnetohydrodynamics. I broke it into 3 pieces on my little sheet here. Otherwise, I couldn't get that all out, especially after a beer or 2, you know?
Well, actually, my last name is the thing that is very frequently mispronounced. I've heard everything from Cassibry to Cassidy to Cassabo. So,
okay,
I don't know where they got that one, but anyway, yes, you nailed all of it. That's because you're a professional.
No. I do one. I am one by night. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight.
Sure, my pleasure.
And want to talk about a lot of stuff. A lot of people sent in questions. Mm-hmm. How did you? If you could give our listeners a little bit of background. And the reason why I love to have you on the show here is I think we are kind of at that cusp in time for space travel. I mean, for so many years there was so many things going on, and things have kind of lulled out and flattened out, and now it seems like we're ready to start making these. We're thinking about the future, and that was just reading your bio and looking through a lot of papers and articles and stuff that you're involved with. You're an amazing gentleman, and the work you do. I'd love to have you give our listeners a background about how you got into this and what you do, and if we could kind of talk about a lot of different things tonight and interesting things that, without a doubt, affect all of mankind.
Well, I'm very happy to have this conversation, and I'll certainly do my best to field whatever questions your audience has. But okay, so to get started, I guess sometime in high school, I sort of settled on a career in engineering and then kind of focused on aerospace engineering. And I was kind of a nerd and read things like Discover Magazine and Omni and Final Frontier and stuff like that. And there was an article in one of them that had it was a discussion on fusion propulsion and how it could open up the solar system for space travel. And that just captured my imagination like nothing. And I just kind of focused on that. But it took me a really long time to actually get into that field because so I went through my bachelor's degree, and this was from 92 until 97. And so the web was invented while I was in the middle of college. And so there weren't a lot of ways to research and find out about stuff other than the old standard of going to the library. And I asked professors in the aero department and the nuclear engineering department, and they just thought I was crazy. Where's this guy come off talking about fusion propulsion? That's for crackpots. And so I got that was at University of Missouri Rolla, and I got my master's at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And while I was there, I met a gentleman by the name of George Miley. He's a professor in the nuclear department, and he taught a course, Introduction to Fusion. And I thought, well, at least I can learn a little about it, because I maintained that desire to do that. I just didn't know who to talk to until I met him. And he said that I really should consider a PhD and go to Huntsville, Alabama, because they were starting a program at NASA Marshall. So I studied up a little bit on the concept that was getting pursued, made a phone call, and kind of got lucky because the person that ended up being my advisor at University of Alabama in Huntsville, with Dr. S.T. Wu, and it just so happened that he had been talking to the scientist that was leading the fusion effort at NASA. And so I just happened to call the right person and say all the right magic words, and I talked to Francis and hit it off with him really well, and got a fellowship, and that's kind of how I got my beginnings in it. So I got my PhD. I finished up in 2004, and was a research professor, and then I was hired on as a tenure track professor at UAH. They don't normally do that, but there was sort of a period of a couple of years where they hired some of the folks that were local there, and I was one of them. Was very fortunate, and then made tenure here a couple of years ago. But right around 2009, advanced propulsion was really hitting a low spot. I mean, there was kind of a revolution in funding in the 90s and early 2000s, and then it just dropped off again after the Challenger, had the tragedy over Texas. The funding just dried up because they had to focus all their efforts on return to space flight and completing the space station, all that, and so there was just nothing left. And so I managed to get some funding out of the Department of Energy to continue in fusion, doing modeling in support of some other work. And then finally, things started turning around in 2009. I met a gentleman by the name of Bill Seidler, who was a senior technical fellow at the Boeing company. And he approached me and said that there is this large pulse power machine that they want to decommission. It was used for other purposes, and but he would like to bring it to a university to start a fusion propulsion program. And I said, "You're a man after my own heart," and we were, kindred spirits, and he's become a fantastic mentor to me. But a lot of how one gets into something like this is that you just have to have a desire to do it and just not let go of it. You just keep pursuing it, learning everything that you can, and taking every opportunity that comes at you. And that persistence seems to pay off. I mean, we have a very large pulse power facility now at the university. It's not operational yet. We've been working on that for a couple of years, and I would say we're about 80 to 90% to completion with it now. And we'll get over that last hump here soon. But when it fires, it produces 3 terawatts for about 250 nanoseconds.
Wow.
And 3 terawatts is about 20% of the entire world grid power. So the world grid power is somewhere around 15 or 16 terawatts on average. So it's a short-lived pulse, but when it fires, it's tremendous. So we're very excited about that.
I would assume that this experiment has got to be in somewhat of a extremely controlled environment to do this.
Oh yeah, it's in a large building on the Redstone Arsenal, and it's actually dwarfed by some of the other equipment that's in there. But so they do a lot of defense-related work in that building, but it's owned by the Army, but leased to the university for all kinds of fun experiments. But our control room is about 500 feet away from the machine, and there's right now about 2 feet of concrete, and there'll probably be another 2 feet barrier around the machine when we've got the facility completed. So we're going to be very far away from the experiments. But even without that, I mean, if you stood near it, it would produce a lethal dose of X-ray radiation, so you don't want to be there.
Right.
But as long as you just use the ALARA, as low as reasonably, I forget that last what that last stands for, but basically for radiation safety, you just stand as far away as you can. It's just like a camera flash,
right.
A very, very powerful camera flash.
There is that guy that turns into that big green thing from one of those flashes, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, and we tried that on one of the grad students, and
Well, this is without a doubt, cutting edge stuff. With the space program, if we could talk about that a little bit and get into some of the details of what you're doing, but I mean, the space, with the, of course, with the Challenger accident, which, and I don't mean to say this in any disrespect, but as we move forward in any type of field, whatever it is, I mean, there are going to be accidents, there are going to be tragedies. The Challenger accident happened. We learned from that, though. I mean, NASA learned from that. And then, of course, the Columbia accident, again, loss of life, very tragic, but a lot was learned from that. But again, the NASA space program really, and I know budgets and the recession that we're still in. I mean, the economy is nowhere near where it was, but NASA seems to have just flattened out so much. Do you think that NASA will kind of move back into greatness again and kind of lead at least this country forward in space exploration, or is it companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX and groups like what you're doing that are going to kind of pick up the ball and keep us moving? I mean, you guys are the dream builders. You're the ones that take the science fiction, the science fantasy, and make it reality. These terms that we hear about and the work that you're doing. I mean, that was Star Trek not that long ago, and now, I mean, the stuff is starting to materialize. Do you think that there's enough incentive there that we'll continue to move into the future and have these propulsion and drive systems that will take us to the stars?
I absolutely do. But yeah, NASA has really suffered. The funding to NASA has been flat at somewhere between 16 and 18 billion since the early 80s. That's kind of a rough estimate, and they have not inflated it. And so it has gradually become a smaller and smaller chunk of the discretionary budget. I think right now it's around 0.5%. I mean, it's absurdly small for all the fuss that's one way or the other. Compared to some, I mean, you hear the argument, why, we shouldn't be putting people in space when people have, 3 nostrils or whatever, people are, worried about. But I mean, we spend so much more money on defense, on healthcare, on welfare, and those programs are all very, very important. But I mean, NASA is just not even in the noise compared to some of these other things. So to answer your question, I'm extremely optimistic because there are a lot of people within, our university, within NASA, within industry like the Boeing company that are dreamers, and they want to see stuff like this happen. And what it takes is just a lot of people making the arguments and making it clear. Because right now we don't really have strong leadership at the top kind of driving this, and there's no apparent impetus. The Apollo program was sort of the glory day, but it was basically the Apollo program was kind of a showdown with the Russians, to show who had the superior missile technology. And if something good came out of the Cold War, that was one of the things was all the funding that NASA had. But I think at some point soon that's going to give way again. NASA is now pursuing nuclear thermal propulsion, and they're taking it seriously. And there's been a group that's been working on that for a number of years, and now they're looking at testing again. So that was kind of released as of last month. So I think that's very, very exciting. And another thing that kind of gives me hope in regards to that, deep space travel has to have nuclear power, fission and fusion both, really to make space travel routine. I mean, until we learn how to warp space-time and, get there in fractions of a second or something. But it really requires nuclear power, at least with the technologies that we understand now. And the last 2 missions that have utilized nuclear power, there hasn't been much of a fuss, and that's changed very, very quickly, because I remember as recently as 2001, I was a grad student and went to a conference out in Albuquerque, and it was an aerospace propulsion conference, and there was one portion of that conference devoted to nuclear propulsion, and there were protesters that I had to walk around, and they were, no nukes in space, and their concern is
right.
Weaponization or or spreading of radioactive material. And those are legitimate concerns, but the smart aleck in me wanted to say, you're right, we should cleanse all the stars and, put out all of the, basically the nuclear decay reactions that happen, deep in the soil of every planet, because really nuclear reactions, whether fission or fusion, are everywhere. I mean, it's an ubiquitous part of nature. So we need to learn how to use it safely and take advantage of it so that we can send humans around safely and quickly.
Well, I think it gets so much of a so much of a bad rap because of nobody, with of course with the Fukushima situation right now.
Yeah.
People, and I'm not going to get into the political side of it, kind of like I'm sure you don't either, but people, as much as they put down nuclear power, and of course there is just like anything. I mean, it is a fuel. It does create some not so great things that have to be getting rid of. But people will complain about nuclear power and nuclear programs, and yet in most large cities, when you turn on your light switch, if it's not for those reactors down the road, those lights aren't going to come on. I mean, it takes energy and the creation of energy to so we can have lights, so we can watch TV, so we can do whatever. But it gets such a bad rap. But I think if it's used in the correct way, it's really a miracle of science.
Yeah, it really is. And there was something that I forgot to say, and then I wanted to comment on a good point that you're making there, is that ever since 2001, I have not heard any protests. I think Cassini and that Cassini, when it launched, because it has a radiothermal isotope generator on it, there were protests against that launch. But the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which was launched, the New Horizons probe to Pluto, no fuss made whatsoever about those. So that kind of, I don't know how things might change because of the Fukushima reactor, and people are sensitive to that now or not. It's hard to say. But the point you're making there about there's always going to be an element of risk, and I think you kind of touched on that when you talked about the hazards of due to the disasters from the Challenger and the Columbia, and no matter what you do, there's always an element of risk involved, and we just do our best to kind of engineer systems and buy down that risk as best we can. But if we don't take risks, we're not going to do anything exciting. So
exactly. The one thing that I think that seems to be probably the biggest thing on most people's mind as far as space travel is how do we, I don't know if you're, and excuse me if I misunderstood, but with the propulsion systems that you do your research and you work on, I assume that those are drive systems that would be used once a craft is in space. Does that address getting things off the ground here? Because, I mean, that seems to be the biggest obstacle is we've got to break Earth's gravity to get into space, especially if we're talking these large ships, what it takes to launch the shuttle or, the big rockets. Is that something that your group is addressing as well, is how to get this stuff off the ground?
Our particular group in fusion isn't, but we do. I'm affiliated with the Propulsion Research Center, which is led by the director, Dr. Bob Frederick, and he actually does do a lot of research in combustion, both liquid and solid propellant, and combustion instabilities. And so they are concerned about that problem very much. There's really no way to get into orbit that we know of without using chemical rockets. It's a thrust to weight problem. You have to have lots of thrust to basically carry something up into orbit, and there's no way. The only way that you could get around that would be with something like the Orion propulsion system, which was investigated in the 60s, I think, where you basically detonate small atomic bombs, one at a time, and just kind of blast your way into orbit. But for obvious reasons, that is kind of frowned upon, because that for certain would lead to fallout in at least certain localized areas.
Right.
For one mission. So yeah, we're kind of stuck with chemical rockets. Again, unless we figure out how to shut gravity off through some means.
Do you think that we'll see in the future of spaceships, of craft actually being developed in orbit, like on the ISS? I mean, I would assume that if you could build something in space, if you could put something together in space, and I know also that, I don't know if SpaceX is addressing this, but they're talking. I've read some different articles and read a little bit of research about. Today we launch we use a solid rock. We use a fuel to get the rocket off the ground. Of course, we've got the container that's the mechanism that gets it up there. But maybe looking at ways to use those spent rocket motors or those spent fuel chambers to get them into orbit and to be able to put them to some good use and some practical use, and maybe even build a craft out of something like that.
That is certainly something that a lot of people talk about. You hear that idea knocked around. I honestly couldn't tell you why they don't try to do that. I guess it's because it would probably take a big investment just to kind of look through an analysis of how you bring them together, how you dock them, and what kind of infrastructure would be needed in order to do that. But we certainly do throw a lot of waste mass away that just burns back up in the atmosphere. It's a great idea, because we certainly don't have a lot of raw material up in space. So I can't offer much other than I know people talk about, wouldn't it be cool if, these include NASA people, but it doesn't seem to percolate up to the top in any kind of serious way.
Exactly. With your propulsion systems, Jason,
mm-hmm.
are these systems that I mean, do they? How do I put this? Do they need to be refueled, or are these systems that you're working on kind of just perpetual fuel, like a nuclear reaction? I mean, as long as the components are there, they'll continue to create the power.
Yeah. No, this actually would require quite a bit of fuel. A single mission to Mars, let's say that your payload mass is somewhere around 100 tons, which is kind of a typical number, 100, 150 tons for basically the house and the rover and whatever you're taking with you. You need something of the order of 100 to a couple hundred tons of fuel. Now, a fraction of that needs to be fusion, and the rest of it can just be some kind of inert propellant that you mix with it. It's hard to explain in too much detail, but basically what we know as rocket scientists is that the higher the exhaust velocity coming out, the lower the thrust is. And that seems kind of counterintuitive, but when you work out the numbers, you've got fixed power, and you find that thrust is equal to power divided by the exhaust velocity. Sorry, I don't mean to throw out too many equations here. I know it's late. But so in order to get that thrust up high enough so that you have acceleration, you need to mix that high-energy fusion products with a colder inert gas. And so assuming you get that mixed well and expand it out a nozzle, then you can get thrust and high exhaust velocity at the same time. And it's that combination that allows you to get somewhere really fast. But a reactor like that, at least the way we envision it, it would be a pulse system, kind of like your internal combustion engine in your car, which basically is just flashes of explosions of gas and oxygen. So this would be sort of like a tiny explosion of deuterium and lithium, or deuterium and tritium, or something like that, and then that mixes with the surrounding propellant.
Very, very interesting. With these systems, I mean, and maybe you could give our listeners a little bit of with today's technology. Of course, the thing that's on everybody's mind is a trip to Mars right now, and I've heard all kinds of different numbers as far as how long it will take. With today's technology, if we were to, like the Mars One project. Or Bigelow, of course, has some different things, and I understand that SpaceX is even considering some things. With today's technology and what we have, how long would it take to get from Earth to Mars versus the type of stuff you're working on as far as time goes? I mean, could you talk a little bit as far as that, as far as time it would take to get to places?
Yeah. So right now the technology that we have is chemical propulsion. And to get to Mars it takes about it's something around 2 years. I'm sorry, that's the round trip. The single one-way trip is something like a year, or maybe a little less than that, depending on how everything lines up. It's a very long time. And with nuclear propulsion, you can push that down to maybe about 6 to 8 months. So nuclear thermal propulsion can get you there a bit quicker, and solar electric is another one which I hadn't mentioned yet, but that's kind of a competitor with nuclear thermal, and they're comparable in terms of how quickly they get there. With fusion, you could get to Mars. We've actually done design missions working with the Advanced Concepts Office at Marshall. You can get there one way in a month with an advanced system.
Wow.
So yeah, it's moving.
Now, let me ask you this, and again, I just don't know. I'm so curious on these subjects. When we went to the moon, my understanding is that of course the rocket took off, got it into orbit. The ship circled the Earth. A burn was done to shoot the rocket toward the command module and the lander and everything, the service module to the moon, and essentially it was that push and then the moon's gravity to put the spaceship in orbit, if you will, around the moon and then land on the moon. When we go to Mars, is it very similar where, again, the speed is built up as the ship goes around the Earth, a burn is established, or is it a series of burns, or is it a gigantic pulse? How does that work? I mean, for the layman that doesn't understand, I mean, is the engine running all the time? Obviously, with a solid rocket propellant, it runs out of fuel. But I mean, is it you know what I'm getting at? How do we get there?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. Well, okay, so once this thing is assembled, and it would probably be done at a Lagrange point, kind of a stable orbit between the Earth and Moon. When this thing takes off, it would have a slight spiral as it comes out of Earth's gravity well, and then it would go on to Mars, and it would pulse at something like 10 hertz. It would just be kind of like this rapid fire like that. And it would continue accelerating like that for a period of maybe 2 weeks to a month. And it would coast. So probably the earlier fusion propulsion systems would take more like a three-month trip time. And the reason for that is because while you can do that 1 month, it takes a lot of fuel. Because it's like, the faster you go, the more fuel you got to dump out the exhaust in order to get to that velocity. So probably a more affordable option would be the way. So under that scenario, you burn for a few weeks, you coast for maybe a month or two, and then you turn the ship around and then you fire to slow it back down to do the orbit insertion.
Interesting. So it's not a solid burn. It's kind of a pulse action.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Fringe Radio Show. Our guest tonight is Dr. Jason Cassibry. Doctor, thank you so much for giving up your Saturday night and spending some time with us.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
We were talking a little bit before the break again about the essentially the pulse to get us out there. A couple questions came in for you. I want to go ahead and pose them to you. It says, what about, this is Bill in upstate New York, he writes and it says, what about using ion thrusters for propulsion, and can they hold enough energy for long flights?
Yes, well, that's a good question, and the answer to that is yes, they can, and they actually do. If you Google the Dawn mission, D-A-W-N, as in like dawn as in the morning, this is a propulsion system to explore asteroids, and so that uses an ion thruster. So it's a very, very good question, and their primary propellant is xenon for various reasons. And noble gases, heavy noble gases like xenon and krypton, make really good propellants for ion thrusters, and so they are used. And one of the options for an advanced propulsion system beyond the capabilities of nuclear thermal would be nuclear electric with either ion thrusters or what's called a Hall thruster, H-A-L-L, Hall thruster. So both of those have electrostatic propulsion mechanisms that accelerate gases at high velocities.
What do you think about, now I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correct, something called is it the AQBA or the AQBA warp drive or warp theory?
The QBA warp drive or warp theory. So I have to admit I'm not completely familiar with that. So what have you read on it? Is that a new?
There is a group out there. I'll have to do a little bit more digging on it. Of course, it's all theoretical at this time, but it's a large group that I believe it's Anderson Scientific is the name of the company. I could be wrong. I'll have to do a little bit of research. But they're essentially, we talk about Star Trek and the warp drive system, and they say the AQBA drive is the reality of that, and maybe you could speak on some of these things.
Sure.
Warp technology, do you think it is really far-fetched, or is it maybe not here today, but not that far down the road we may be able to look at that type of propulsion system?
I think it's absolutely going to be figured out. It's elusive as of yet, so I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to look that one up. But as I know now, there's no known low power way to access warping space-time in a meaningful way, in that it requires a tremendous amount of energy in order to do it. But having said that, I think as we understand field theory and understand the connections between the various fundamental forces, I think eventually that's going to be figured out. I have a feeling that it'll probably be something along the lines of clever manipulation at various harmonic frequencies of space-time, and probably require lots of power, but we'll have ways of generating that power in small packages. So that's just my kind of gut feeling on that. But I absolutely think that somebody's going to figure that out along the way.
Yeah, it's called the.
So maybe, who knows?
Yeah, it's the Anderson. It's the I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly. The AQBA warp drive. It's Anderson. The AndersonInstitute.com.
Okay, I'll have to look that one up.
Found some. Yeah. I mean, there's so much stuff out there on the internet, and it's interesting. Like you said, when you were going to school, that's like myself. That's when the internet really kind of came to life. I remember the years of the old bulletin board services, and I thought that was amazing. And now to see what we have, out there is unbelievable. Another question is how much radioactive material would a nuclear-powered spacecraft carry in order for its propulsion system to work?
The amount of fissionable material that you need is could probably fit in a can that's maybe feet wide and a similar length tall. So like a cylinder, maybe like 4 feet by 3 feet in diameter or something like that. It's actually not that much, and the fission's kind of weird. It's very simple in that if you have enough stuff and bring it close enough together, it heats up and generates reactions. But if you pull enough of it away so it's kind of below that criticality level, and I'm not a nuclear engineer, so I'm kind of a monkey talking about this, what I've memorized, but if you were to, it's really not that much material, and it's not significantly radioactive in its initial state. It's only when you turn the reactor on that it fires up and would become radioactive. It's not that much, actually.
It's amazing. It's amazing the technology and the brilliant minds out there that are putting this all together. I just hope that, I mean, obviously you're having big successes. Do you think that you're kind of on the cusp of seeing, and I've asked this before, but seeing this stuff put to practical use? Is your group, would obviously before they put a human in one of these spacecraft, one of these powered spacecrafts, do you feel that maybe someday this technology, these drive systems, will go in a probe of sorts to see how they work?
Well, yeah. So, in fact, we actually just kind of figured out the story that we think that we're going to follow. And ask me in a year, it'll probably change. But I'm really kind of excited about this. The tough part with doing fusion, apart from the fact that we've been working on making a reactor produce energy greater than you invested in it in the first place since the 50s. It's a very tough problem. But we finally have kind of figured out the archetype that I think would allow us to evolve the technologies and use it at the same time. So we have a concept for a propulsion system that is modestly augmented by fusion reactions. So we already know how to make fusion reactions. We just don't know how to make it so that it's plentiful enough that the energy comes out exceeds what you dumped into it in the first place. But if you can produce just a little bit, even like 0.01% of the mass of the material fuses, you've generated a tremendous amount of energy, because it's amazing how much energy is locked at the nuclear level between the protons and neutrons. And so we've kind of figured out how that can sort of augment the propulsion system. And if you had a nuclear electric system on board to drive that, then as you evolve the technologies, you get better with doing the fusion. The fusion becomes more and more important and will increase the propulsion system performance. And the mass penalty that's there with the nuclear reactor and the radiators that have to keep it cool will become smaller and smaller in proportion to that thrust that's generated. And so over the course of maybe a generation or two, you go from a system that maybe takes you 6 months to get to Mars down to something that takes 3 months or less. So we think we finally have that archetype laid out that would allow us to just evolve this gradually. So we're really excited about that.
Very, very interesting. Another question for you, Doctor, is what type of propulsion do you think was used in the malfunctioning rocket that caused the Norway spiral a few years ago? That supposedly was a Russian test. Now, again, I know in your talking points you talked a little bit about UFOs and stuff like that, and I'd love to get into that in the next hour.
Oh, absolutely.
But that spiraling, do you think that was of this Earth? Your thoughts on that?
I think that probably was, because that corkscrew effect is something that is kind of common with a missile that's misfiring or malfunctioning. So that's it's easy to get a missile fire wrong, and that's one of the things that can happen is that kind of spiraling or corkscrew. So I think that one is probably of terrestrial origins.
So do you think it was something that was just out of control?
Yeah. I admittedly, I don't know a lot about some of the stabilization mechanisms on board missiles, but if something like that malfunctions and it doesn't have the right control, it could spiral out. It could have been that it was being developed by a team of Bigfoot, and so so that's another story.
Well, hey, it's all that fringy stuff that keeps us moving forward. With right now, just to get you're kind of in the thick of things. As far as a trip to Mars, do you think that again, the Mars One group is talking about I've seen dates as far, as close as 2018. They say that's going to be one of the best launch windows. Obviously, the launch window is important for the distance of the planets. I know they're trying to raise money, and as big as much publicity as Mars One gets, I think their funding is somewhere around $100,000. Probably not enough to even buy a spacesuit. But do you think that if it's not Mars One, do you think we'll see maybe within this decade a launch to Mars with the technology that we have today?
I do. I think probably sometime in the 2020s. I know that Dennis Tito was trying to do that mission in 2018, and there are other groups. And I would be very surprised if that actually happens by that, because that's a really short time to have everything developed and ready to go and tested the way it should be. But I think in the 2020s, we're going to have several launch options for putting a capsule, on basically to Mars, and I think we're going to see that, because I think people are so tired. I mean, I came into learning about aerospace and space flight as an undergraduate and graduate student, and I was bored with it then.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only so much you can relate to watching astronauts go in a circle around Earth's orbit. Nobody was really. I mean, we're excited about it. It's fun to go to a launch, and it's awesome. But it's. I mean, I think. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think it's boring.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of great science that's done, but we're not pushing the boundaries, and I don't think the benefits are as great to us if we're not doing hard things like sending humans to other places.
Do you think that if we, I mean, and this is a question that I've had different listeners send in when we've had different people on the show that want to talk about, the Mars trips. Do you believe that maybe before we would do a Mars trip, we may see one more lunar landing or one more trip to the moon? Or do you think that we've kind of beaten that enough, and now it's time to just, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it and press on and go to Mars?
I'll tell you what I hope that we do. I hope that our first destination is a nearby asteroid, because it's a nice incremental step, and there's some meaningful work that can be done in learning how to dock with an asteroid, maybe move it, or do prospecting. And it's an easy mission because you don't have to have a heavy lifter to get back out of the gravity well. I don't know what we're going to do next. If you read NASA Watch or read the headlines, it seems like the mission changes about every 3 days or so.
Right.
So it's hard to say. If I had to guess, I think we're probably going to focus on flybys first, like maybe an asteroid mission, and then maybe a flyby of Mars. I think it'd be really exciting if that was done by private investment. Some kind of flyby stunt just to get people, capture people's imagination. But what we really need is for China to continue their pursuits and landing on the moon and sending humans other places, because I think there's nothing that it's our competitive juices flowing like another powerful country one-upping us.
Right.
I think that's going to be very good for us.